Ali. Thank you very much for joining Secrets of Talent. Really appreciate your time. I think we'll just get straight into it. It'd be very interesting to kind of hear what your very first job was and what that journey was like to becoming the group HR director for Babcock.
Sure. Morning, Isa. Nice speaking with you. So I started off as a recruiter um, many years ago, 30 odd years ago. I started my career. I started off as an IT recruiter doing permanent and contract recruitment in the IBM mid-range market. So that was my very first job, and it really set me up well for trying to sort of get that experience of what people do within organizations. But secondly, I think gave me the confidence to be able to have conversations with people as well. What then happened was that I was then moved from doing recruitment in the contingent and permanent market to doing exec search. And then back in 98, so a long time ago, probably before things like in-house recruiters existed, I was headhunted by an American software company to become their in-house recruitment director. And that was my first foray into the in-house world. And subsequent to that, I've never gone back to industry. I've stayed within the corporate confines in recruitment, business development, generalist HR. And how it brought me to Babcock was about in sort of, I think, 2008. I looked at my career and said I'd never worked for a large company and I'd never worked outside of IT professional services. And I want to do something different. And the steel and mining company headhunted me. And at the time, they had revenues of over 115 billion, 320,000 headcount. So they ticked the box of being big. They ticked the box of being different. I stayed there for 8 years. And by that time, I kind of did everything I wanted to do, in particular, learning about workforce planning, which was kind of new. And I led that for that organization. Babcock came calling in 2016, and I joined Babcock in October 2016 as their resourcing, people analytics, and workforce planning director. And then about 2 years ago, I was promoted into the group HR director role with specific responsibility for analytics, workforce planning, and recruitment for the organization. So ostensibly, actually, what I say to people is all of this experience is great, but I'm a bit like a stick of Brighton rock. If you cut me through the middle, we'll still read recruiter. My background is I'm a recruiter.
It's a good way of ending it because I think you started as your recruiter and ended as a recruiter in terms of your
Yeah.
bit of intro there. But then, of course, if you're a recruiter, then clearly you must have hired people. Uh, there's a difference, obviously, between hiring for other people and hiring for yourself because you look from a different perspective. So when you were hiring for yourself, what was that? What was your very first hire, and what was that like for yourself?
Yeah. So I suppose when you say for myself, if you're talking about hiring into my team,
Correct. Yeah.
as opposed to, yeah, so I look at it, I give that in two parts. So when I first joined the American IT consultancy, I had to build a team. So that was a first time in-house that I recruited for myself, as opposed to when I was working in the exec search area where I was a manager and recruited for my own team. But in terms of recruiting for somebody to work in my team, and with me, the things I look for are a number of things. The first one is I put a lot of credence on mental capability and intelligence. And the reason is that I have quite a analytical and evidence-based approach to the way I work. And I recall an ex-CFO of mine who once said the biggest problem with HR is they come to meetings with far too many PowerPoints and not enough Excel. And I really fundamentally believe that we in HR, for whatever reason, have not really understood the importance of insight, data, and analytics. And we still say things like, well, we can feel it in my water, and I've done this a long time, and etc. Whereas actually we need that data and insight. So for me, people who have that mental capability to look at data, analyze data, and look at insight is really, really important. So I look at that as absolutely number one facet. I think the second thing I look at is somebody who is able to work well within the team. So I think the team dynamic is really, really key. I don't believe that you can have one person who no matter how big a superstar is, that the impact that they would have on the team being negative is worth having, because I think there is the synergistic aspect of the team working well is bigger than the sum of the individuals added together. So for me, having that somebody who fits into the team and actually adds value. And then the corollary to that is I always think of a team a bit like jigsaw pieces. So jigsaw pieces fit together well, and they're very strong because where one of them has an empty space, the next piece fills it in. If you put square blocks together, they don't fit together. They stick together, but they come apart if you move them or push them, because what they are is they're replicas of each other. They don't have strengths where others have weaknesses. Jigsaw puzzles, on the other hand, where you have a missing bit, the other one fits in. And I think the strength comes from the fact that they complement each other rather than replicate. So what I look for is people who can complement the wider team. They have strengths where we have weaknesses and vice versa. So for me, those are always the big things I look at. I look at mental capability, fit into the team, and bring something that is missing in the team already.
So clearly, then there is a whenever you hire, you always have to look, you can review your existing talent pool every single time before you make that next
Absolutely.
hire.
Absolutely. So I look at two things. Well, three things. I look at what's the problem I'm trying to solve. So why am I recruiting? What's the business problem I'm trying to solve, and ensuring that the person I take on solves the problem, not just fills a job. The second one is, of course, they're going to be part of a team. So I need to look at the current team and look at, based on the direction of travel and the problem I want to solve, what's the missing piece that allows me to do that rather than just fill a role. And then lastly is just having a look at, do they fit into the team as a personality and they don't disrupt the totality. So yes, so all of those things I look at when I'm recruiting for myself.
And all of these things will be very important to sort of turbulent times when economies go through, companies go through economic cycles. And how can companies build a more sort of resilient workforce when it comes to challenging times, particularly now where we've just come through the pandemic and boom, we're
Yes.
about to we're hitting a current recession, cost of living crisis, which will impact people whether they're in work or out of work.
That's a $1 million question, isn't it? Because we're seeing the exact opposite right now, which is we're seeing high numbers of organizations having more than usual attrition. I was looking at some data from Gartner recently where it says that 2/3 of employees are potentially going to be looking for a job. We're seeing a real increase in companies offering counter offers because they know they're going to the market and hiring skills is difficult. We're seeing, and you and I both know this, Isa, there's a fallacy around people move because of money. People move for many reasons, but nobody really generally moves for a drop in pay. So it's easy to say, oh, well, Ali moved because he got paid more. That's a reason. No, he didn't look because of that, but he's not going to leave for less. So that's not the motivator. Whereas actually, I think in particular for some people who are in lower paid jobs and even medium paid jobs today, we're seeing people move for more money because of the cost of living crisis. Because, we know, the use of food banks has gone up by 300%, right? So people are finding it much more difficult. So money's becoming a motivator as well. So how do you build resilience? I think there's two big elements, in my humble opinion. I think the first one is resilience from a company perspective, and that's about workforce planning, to actually ensure you understand what do you need in terms of skill sets and capabilities, both in terms of capacity and capability, i.e. numbers and skills for the long term, and you build towards that. We currently have a ratio of almost 1-to-1 between the number of vacancies and the number of unemployed, regardless of skills in the country.
True, yeah.
It's the first time we've had that maybe for half a century. There's a real shortage of skills. So relying on being able to go to the market and hire ready-made skills, in particular in my area, which is engineering as a company, not going to happen. So the words I use to my business quite a lot is you ain't going to recruit your way out of this. So what does that mean? You've got to concentrate a lot more on things like upskilling, reskilling, capability development, training and development. How does that work in terms of resilient workforce? Two ways. The first one is you have a resilient workforce because you're not relying on the market. The second one is you're increasing capability of your people. And as people become better qualified, better capable, you have the opportunity to move them up within the organization and backfill below them with less experienced, less capable people that you're building up in line. We find, or I believe, that what that gives you is two things. One is it protects you against market forces in terms of shortage of skills. And the secondly, it gives you some loyalty from your workforce because you're developing them. As you develop them, you're giving them bigger roles. As you give them bigger roles, you're allowing them to have a bigger earning capability. And you're bringing in people at the bottom who probably wouldn't have the opportunity if you were recruiting ready-made skills to ever join my company. But you're recruiting them at the bottom and you're training them up. And I'm not necessarily talking about apprentices here. I'm talking about adult apprenticeships. I'm talking about cross-skilling and reskilling. So give you a very quick example. Mechanical fitters is something that we struggle with. But whenever I drive to our operations, I always drive past people on the roadside wearing a high-vis jacket fixing someone's car in the rain. Now, that RAC or AA person, why wouldn't I be able to hire them into my organization and put them through an intensive training program and give them a real career that they can actually work in repairing submarines rather than repairing a Volvo?
Yeah, interesting. It's a very interesting question. I think particularly now where many people are feeling the crunch, people are feeling the crunch. They have to think differently about how they think about their careers, and especially like, as we mentioned earlier, it's not just a difficult time for employees, but it's also a difficult time for employers as well because the both ends of the scale. There is a typically when it's tough economic, when it's recession, etc., it hits the employers first, and then that trickle down effect hits the employees. But this time it's a double-edged sword. It's both of them hitting both ways. But I guess this sort of brings me down next to in terms of June, so these tougher times when it comes to spotting and developing the talent potential. Are there any sort of hacks out there where spotting talent potential in the workforce?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there is always opportunity to be better at it than companies are. I don't think there's any shortcuts, and I don't think I would necessarily call it a hack. I do think there are a couple of things that work well. I think the first one is actually having a proper talent and joined up talent and succession process. I see a lot of companies who talk a lot about talent, but have no well-grounded succession process. And one of the questions I always have in my head is when you talk about a talent, there needs to be an acid test, which is what are they a talent for? And how do they know if they've met their talent capability? How do you know if they've achieved that potential that we talk about? And one of the ways of measuring it is succession. So did I nominate Isa to be a successor for a couple of roles in my organization? And when those roles came available, did Isa get those roles? And if the answer is yes, I nominated him and no, he didn't, then I have to ask myself, how robust is my talent process? So one of the things is there needs to be a measure of what is the value of that talent rather than just nominating what I used to refer to as good blokes or good girls into a talent process. We shouldn't be nominating talent because they are replicas of me, or they went to the right university, or they did the right course. What we should be looking at is the impact they have on the organization through their ability to grow and develop. So I define talent, along with a couple of people I talk to, as talent for me are individuals that who have the capability, brain power, resilience, and desire that given the right opportunity and support can make material and accelerated progress within an organization. And if you're seeing talent not make those accelerated progress in an organization, they're not talent. So what are the hacks, as you called it? I think the first one is to define what does success look like in your organization and measure against the success criteria rather than your own personal criteria. The second one is once you've identified those talents is how do you make them ready? So let's take you and me. So you will say, well, do you know what? I think Ali can be my successor in 3 years. Great. I'm nominated as a talent and I can be Isa's successor in 3 years. What does that say? Does it say Ali is just 365 multiplied by 3 days too young for this role? and once he's 3 years older, he'll automatically get the job. It's just a question of age. No. What you're saying is Ali's lacking a certain capability that I think takes him about 3 years to develop, gain, and at which point, once he's gained that additional capability and experience, he's ready for my job. Right. If you then identify me and say these are the gaps, but you then don't put me through a development process, and you don't give me the on-job learning, and you don't give me the mentoring and everything else that goes with it, in 3 years' time, I'm still 3 years away from taking your job, Isa. So there is no hack here, but it's about process. So the first bit of the process is you need to identify what are the success criteria for an organization, for that individual. You then need to identify what are the roles that you want to put those talents into. You then need to identify the gaps in capability between the individual and the role they want to go into. And then you need to give them a pathway and support, training, development on the job, etc., to allow them to bridge the gap. And then you need to measure to actually see, did this process work, or are you just nominating people you like as talent? So for me, there's less of a hack, but more of a process.
Good, and that's a good way of kind of putting it as well, because you're right. There isn't no shortcuts, but it's about finding the right way to get to that end goal. I want to sort of round off this conversation by asking more of a futuristic question. Of course, you've had a very illustrious career in
A long career. Me, I'm an old man. That's what you're saying. I hear you.
illustrious is a word I like to use better, but you've had a good career in this space. What does the future of work hold for talent development, talent acquisition, and talent nurturing talent?
It's a great question. Do you know, for me, it centers around a plan. So you probably gathered with all my answers, it comes to analytics and plans, right? It comes to process and plans. And the plan and process that will help define how we work better in the future is really around, in my opinion, is around having a better understanding of your workforce planning, your strategic workforce planning in particular. One of the problems we have, in particular, in many industries, is that we have gone through cycles of recruiting in good times and firing in bad times. So we go into a hire fire cycle. Yeah. And obviously we just come out of a growth period in the UK where, prior to COVID, there were 700,000 vacancies. August this year, there was 1.3 million vacancies. So almost a doubling of the number of vacancies. Everyone was hiring, salaries were going up. So we went through a good period. Now we're going through a recessionary period, and people are now talking about firing. So we went through this hire fire cycle, and we're going to go through it forever because that's just how cycles work. The hiring and firing is the worst way to manage your business. All right. Why do we do it? It's that old saying from Mark Twain, which says, to a man with a hammer, the whole world looks like a nail. We've spent so long being good at hiring and firing that it looks like the only option we have. And to your point, what we need to do is look at all the other tools of development, apprenticeships, building our own, upskilling, reskilling, looking at reward, looking at mobility, looking at people who want to have a more diversified working experience, people who want to have agile working, agile learning, people who want to work part-time, people who want to work remotely. All of that is very difficult for us to do in isolation. The only way you bring it together is under a plan. And that plan for me is the workforce plan. And that's about having an idea of what is it that you want to do as an organization, and what are the skills and capabilities you need, and what are the different levers from an HR and people perspective that you can pull to make it work. So from a company perspective, I would say the future of work has two things. One is we need to become more okay with uncertainty, and number two is we need to have better planning processes rather than, and I'll give you an example of hiring and firing again, which is we just resort to the worst behaviors of, if the market's good, we all go out and hire and we increase salaries and have competition. When the market's bad, we all think about how do we reduce costs by firing as many people as quickly as possible. So for me, the future of work challenge is people becoming more holistic in the way they approach the people challenges.
And excuse me, it puts into practice the importance of planning, as you rightly said. And no, Ali, I really appreciate this conversation. I think there's a lot of insight here that I can take away for myself as I go into my career, but also I'm sure others will take away from this as well. Thank you very much for your time, Ali.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Isa.